Let's take a look at class systems within the United States. There's a variety of ways to do this, but about the last 20 years or so, last 15 to 20 years, sociologists generally have been using kind of a model that was originally presented by Daniel Rasides, where we're going to break down groups of people into certain categories. We'll talk about the upper class, the upper middle, the lower middle, and then the working class and the poor. And so we'll talk about those groups. Now, you could divide it any number of ways, but that's kind of the model that's been used lately anyway. In terms of the upper class, okay, let's talk about them first. The upper class consists of about the top 1% of the population. That's what's been in the news, when they talk about the top 1%. They're generally highly educated people. There's not really a question when they have children whether or not the kids are going to go to college or not. It's assumed they're going to go to college. The only question is which prestigious university are they going to go to. So that's one of the things right off the bat. They tend to include investors and their heirs, some of the top executives around the country. Income, we'll talk about income for these classes, but I want you to understand that there's no hard and fast rule on income. I'm going to give you some, estimates that basically we look at, but again, there is no hard and fast rule. A lot of it depends on how many people are in the household and that sort of thing. So, but for the upper class, we're talking about people who generally bring in about $500,000 or so a year in terms of income. Now, the people in the upper class tend to be very involved in politics. They tend to be very involved in volunteer organizations, things of that nature, and tend to be known on a pretty big scale. Now, we can also kind of divide this into what we call old money and new money. Old money is groups or families where the money's been held for generations. The prestige for these people tend to be on a national level. For example, if we talk about the Rockefellers or the Kennedys or the Roosevelts, those are people that everybody kind of knows. And that money's been passed on through inheritance and things like that. Now, new money is typically acquired due to somebody's efforts. So the wealth will still be the same types of things, still buys the same stuff, but the prestige is not nearly the same as the old money. So that's, generally speaking, the upper class. Now, the upper middle class, let's see here, there we go. The upper middle class, generally we're talking about the next 15% or so of the population. Normally consist of high income professions, definitely white collar or professional people with a college education, a lot of postgraduate studies. We're talking about doctors, lawyers, architects, things like that. Career-oriented, and the prestige level tends to be on the community level. Most of the kids that come out of these families, again, are assumed to go to college. Maybe not in the prestigious colleges that the upper class talks about, but they're going to be college oriented. Many of these people will also be actively involved in politics and voluntary associations as well, but their prestige level tends to be more on like a state level rather than like on a national level that we were talking about before. Income for this group generally in the neighborhood of $100,000 or more on a yearly basis. Let's talk about the lower middle class. Now, the lower middle class makes up a lot bigger percent of the population, you see. We're talking about white-collar jobs, but yet less money and less education. Although a lot of these people do have either some college education or sometimes have college degrees. Now, the examples of this would be people who run small businesses or lower level managers, craftspeople, foremen, teachers, nurses, those kinds of examples. Income in this area generally in the ballpark of, let's say, $40,000 to $70,000 on a yearly income. This is one area of this grouping, the socioeconomic status categories that we were talking about. The lower middle class is one area that has changed dramatically, basically, when we talk about the types of work that people have nowadays. To give you an idea, back in the 1940s, we only had about 31% of all workers that held white-collar jobs. But yet by the 2000s, we're now up around 73% or higher that hold white-collar occupations. Now, let's continue with the working class. Working class makes up about 30% of the population. Formerly, it was the largest segment of people in America, but again, some people have been moving up into the lower middle class over the last 20 years. In this category, we're talking about a lot of blue-collar occupations. By blue-collar, we mean manual labor. Normally, they have a high school education. Occasionally, they'll have a little bit of college. They typically don't have a college degree. They include factory workers, clerical workers, low-paid retail sales, things like that, truck drivers, craftspeople. Normal income on a yearly basis for people in this category, anywhere from like $23,000 to $35,000, in that ballpark range. The working class is, again, noticeably declining in size, basically as service and technical jobs are starting to replace positions in the actual manufacturing or transportation of goods. Some members of the working class, for example, electricians, might even make more money than some people in the lower middle class, but they tend to associate and hang around or relate more with the blue-collar working class people. So that's where, again, Weber was talking about, the wealth, the power, and the prestige, those can be very different depending on where you're at and stuff. But if you kind of group yourself according to who you hang around with a lot of times. Now, the last category that we look at here is the lower class. Makes up, unfortunately, about a fifth of our population, and this consists of many of them, minimum wage jobs, unemployed people, part-time employment. Unfortunately, a lot of elderly people are in this category. We would also include homeless and unskilled. The lower class has a disproportionate number of blacks, Hispanics, and single moms with dependent children in this category. A lot of people who cannot find regular work. Income in this area generally $15,000 or less in terms of these categories. Now, as I said, these are some kind of ballpark generalizations about the different classes. Now, in, I'd say the last 15 years or so, some other researchers, Joseph Call and Dennis Gilbert, actually broke down the lower class into kind of two different groups. So remember, the lower class, we were talking about the bottom 20%. Well, they actually kind of broke it down even more. And they said that you can take that lower class and divide it into what they call the working poor. Now, the working poor, these would be people getting the lowest paying jobs, or maybe they have seasonal employment. They're working hard, they're living week to week, paycheck to paycheck, barely making a living wage. Most of these are high school dropouts, sometimes illiterate. They may depend on government support programs such as food stamps, things like that. But again, the normal income for this would be generally in the $15,000 to $20,000 range. Okay, and then they break it down and they talk about basically the worst of the worst, and that would be the underclass. And the underclass makes up about 4% of the population. Now, this term basically it refers to people concentrated in the inner cities. This includes families that have experienced unemployment and poverty over several generations. It's just a thing that they're born into it and they never can get out of it or seem not to be able to. Many of these people are homeless. A lot of times their chief source of income is some type of public assistance, and every day for these people is a struggle for survival. They never know for sure where or when their next meal is actually going to come. So for these people, generally we're talking about less than $10,000 in income on a yearly basis.